Well, welcome and good evening to welcome to Kopernik and welcome to our Friday night live stream, our Kopernik FNL. I'm Drew Desker, the director of Kopernik Observatory, and very happy to have you join us here this evening for our program. Before we get started, I don't know all who's watching currently, but just want to maybe do a very quick introduction if this may be your first time watching our live stream. Kopernik is an observatory, a public observatory and science center in Binghamton, New York, or actually technically Vestal, New York, near Binghamton. We've been open for over 45 years, and every Friday night we try to do a public program of some sort on some aspect of science or engineering, and then if it's clear, we will open up our domes. Well, right now, the safe thing to do is to at least do the public program piece here through our live streams. We actually hope to be able to open back up to the public. We are looking very closely at the state and local health guidelines, and we think as long as we keep wearing that mask and getting people vaccinated, that we can try to get people back here sometime this summer. So we'll be able to have actual, in-person live public programs, as well as doing observing, through our telescopes sometime this summer. We have actually, we already had our first public event, if you will, a couple weeks ago. We had a 5K race called Race to the Stars, had almost 100 runners up here running on the rolling hills, which was a lot of fun. We are now in the process of finishing up our registration for our Rocket Fest, where families and individuals will build those Estes rockets. This year, they're going to build them at home and then come up on the 22nd. If you go to if that interests you, I think we may have maybe 2 slots left for 9 a.m. We're going to shoot off over 100 rockets on May 22nd, so we're very excited about that. And we are planning to do in-person summer camps for students that are entering 2nd grade through 12th grade. We have a nice range of topics on science, aspects of science and engineering. We're even offering some virtual camps as well. So please go to our website and you can check that out. We will be doing some additional, we got another 4 live streams set up. Next week, we have a couple of BU professors talking about cicadas, the singers of summer, and in particular, Brood X, that's beginning to emerge now. The week after that will be a gentleman from the National Weather Service talking about skywarn recognition and becoming a skywarn spotter. And then we'll have somebody from Cornell talk about a planetary survey with some of the images that they've got. But this evening, we have Dr. John Swierk. He's a chemistry professor from Binghamton University, and just a very small story about that. I listened to a podcast called Shortwave. It's about anywhere between 10 and 15 minutes. It's just long enough for my drive from my home to here to Kopernik. And one time they were talking about the sort of the chemistry behind tattoos, and they say, and for a comment on that, we'll turn to Binghamton University professor John Swierk. I'm like, whoa! So had to quickly look him up, and we started a discussion, and perhaps maybe we'll even talk about tattoos at some other time. But one thing that really caught my eye on his website was alchemy, and again, I had my kids a little older, and so I tell my kids, yeah, back when I was in school, we called it alchemy, not chemistry. But anyway, I just thought it'd be interesting to see, how did we get from early science to where we are now. And John very graciously agreed to present tonight. We've got a nice group of 18 people watching already, and so John, I'll let you take it from here and go ahead and inform us. Thanks.
Right. Well, thank you, Drew, and thank you for the opportunity to be here. So I'll go ahead and get my slides up, and we'll go ahead and get started. All right. So in 1703, Isaac Newton, the great mathematician and leading natural philosopher of his age, took over the presidency of the Royal Society in London. Now, the society had been the first national scientific society, chartered 41 years earlier in 1662, with the intention of being a beacon of science to the world. However, by 1703, the once great society was a shadow of its former self. Membership had fallen from over 200 members in the society's earliest years to just 41 in the year 1700. Weekly sessions were sparsely attended by members and even more infrequently attended by the president of the Royal Society. Publication of the Society's journal, Philosophical Transactions, had been suspended on more than one occasion. The Society's finances were in disarray, with dues and arrears and bankruptcy on the horizon. In short, things looked bleak for the once great beacon of science. That Isaac Newton would take on the role of the president of the Royal Society is remarkable in and of itself. As a man, he abhorred controversy, which the Royal Society seemed to offer in abundance, and he had no love for many of the members of the time. In fact, though Newton himself was a member of the Royal Society, he had rarely attended meetings before 1703. So it's surprising that not only would Newton accept the presidency of the Royal Society, but that over the 24 years he led the organization, transform it into a scientific and social force. Many of the concepts so deeply ingrained in modern science were formalized by the Royal Society: publication and peer review, government support of science, and the need to have an open dialogue among scientists. For many, the foundation and development of the Royal Society marks the capstone of the scientific revolution that began in 1543 with Copernicus and his publication of On the Revolutions of the Heavenly Spheres. Through Newton's stewardship of the Royal Society, his mentorship of its fellows, and his seminal contributions to physics, optics, and mathematics, Newton, in a very real way, set the course of modern science. When we look back, he is one of the first links in an unbroken chain of scientists leading to the present day. Yet, if Newton was one of the first links in the chain of modern science, he was also the last link in a chain of alchemists stretching back almost 1,400 years. For all his work on physics, optics, and mathematics, Newton spent more time on his alchemical pursuits. He ardently pursued the discovery of the philosopher's stone, the mythic substance believed to be able to convert base metals into gold, and he may have even pursued the elixir of life. A modern examination of his hair demonstrated that he suffered from mercury poisoning, likely as a consequence of his alchemical activities. And in the last century, John Maynard Keynes, the legendary economist and man who rediscovered Newton's alchemical writings, wrote, "Newton was not the first of the age of reason. He was the last of the magicians, the last of the Babylonians and Sumerians, the last great mind which looked out on the visible and intellectual world with the same eyes as those who began to build our intellectual inheritance rather less than 10,000 years ago. Isaac Newton, a posthumous child, born with no father on Christmas Day, 1642, was the last wonder child to whom the Magi could do sincere and appropriate homage." Like Newton, the story of alchemy is largely misunderstood. In the hands of many practitioners, over the span of centuries, alchemy blazed an early trail of scientific inquiry and would eventually midwife the birth of modern science. Modern research into alchemy reveals a vibrant community of scholars, developing and applying rational theories into the inquiry about the natural world. In a very real way, the emergence of the field of chemistry was less about the development of a new field and more about partitioning the useful and practical aspects of alchemy away from some of the more embarrassing or sensitive aspects. Understanding what alchemy truly was, where it came from, and how it transformed is essential to understanding the nature of science today. Now, when we think about alchemy, our minds naturally draw a certain type of picture. A lone practitioner working in the dead of the night to discover the secrets of how lead can be transformed into gold. He is secretive, reticent to share his discoveries for fear that he will be imprisoned and his great secrets stolen. Or perhaps your mind goes to Harry Potter and the making of magical potions. In either case, alchemy conjures the vision of something occult, something that exists beyond the bounds of science and reaches into the realm of magic and mystics. But where does that picture come from? And how do we reconcile it with alchemy as a serious scientific pursuit? Alchemy, at least the Western tradition of alchemy, begins in the city of Alexandria in Egypt, somewhere in the 3rd century AD. Now, this was not the Egypt of pyramids and pharaohs, but a cosmopolitan crossroads of the Roman Empire. The Hellenistic legacy of Alexander the Great, fused with Roman industry and commerce, made Alexandria a city apart in Egypt. Already a proto-chemical industry was developing as artisans perfected techniques for making and manipulating glass, compounding cosmetics, and producing imitations of different metals. Thanks to papyri that were discovered in the 1800s, we know these artisans knew how to imitate the look of gold by making solutions of calcium polysulfide that, when exposed to silver, results in the formation of a thin layer of silver sulfide. Now, if you've ever had silver spoons that have tarnished, you know that if caught at just the right point, as you can see here in this picture, that they can appear golden. And in the hands of the artisans of Alexandria, this skill was perfected. So they knew how to imitate gold, but they were quite aware that they were making imitations and not the real metal. Importantly, when we think about alchemy, is that these artisans were not guided by some underlying theory, and instead were following recipes handed down over the centuries. What I mean is that there was no intellectual framework to provide a rational explanation for the phenomenon that these artisans observed, and no hypotheses that could be tested and open the door to new lines of inquiry. Alchemy as a discipline arose when natural philosophers began to fuse the technical knowledge of the artisans with Greek natural philosophy and its speculations about the nature of the universe. The natural philosophers began to wonder that if the surface of the silver could be transformed into gold, then why couldn't the entirety of the silver be likewise transformed? Now, this question was a natural outgrowth of Greek philosophy, which had been musing on the nature of matter for more than 700 years. In the 6th century BC, Thales of Miletus had speculated that all matter was derived from a single primordial substance, water. 100 years later, Democritus proposed the concept of indivisibly small atomoi, from which all matter was formed, where we get the word atom from. And Aristotle, the venerable philosopher, proposed perhaps the most influential theory when he suggested that there were 4 elementary properties: hot, cold, dry, and wet. And that from a combination of these 4 fundamental properties, we could get 4 fundamental elements: earth, air, water, and fire. These elements could then be combined with a prima materia, the first matter, to give form and substance. Most critically, this prima materia was thought to be able to convert one element into another through transmutation. Now, the first alchemists would take these untested philosophical musings from their ancient forebears on the nature of the universe and fuse them with the practical, technical knowledge of Alexandria's artisans. While the original theoretical underpinning of alchemy was generally incorrect, what is important is that through the study of alchemy, hypotheses could be tested and our understanding of matter and the universe revised by the results of those tests. The development of new hypotheses and the testing of them led in a very meaningful way to the recursive system of discovery that we still use in modern science today. Now, when we peer back into the history of alchemy, the first alchemist that stands out to us is Zosimos of Panopolis. Now, through the surviving fragments of his writings, it's clear that he lived in a world where alchemy was already a developed discipline with competing schools of thought. And his earliest writings are a window into Alexandrian alchemy. Unfortunately, they're the only writings we have that survive in any definite form to this day. Now, in Zosimos' writings, he carefully describes alchemical apparatuses and detailed plans of experiments. He frequently cites previous authorities and builds on their work. Most notable of these are Maria Judea, or Mary the Jew, a figure who's borderline mythic in the history of alchemy and credited with the development of numerous techniques. Perhaps most notable of her inventions was the use of a hot water bath to heat something instead of an open flame. This gentle, consistent method of heating survives to today in the form of the bain-marie, or double boiler. Now, as an alchemist, Zosimos began to develop a theory that appears throughout the history of alchemy in various forms. He used fire to treat a variety of metals and minerals, sublimating them, distilling them, volatilizing them, and began to form a theory that metals were comprised of two parts, a non-volatile part, the soma, and a volatile spirit, the pneuma. Now, as far-fetched as this may sound, it really wasn't wild speculation. It's based on solid experimental evidence. So, for example, heating many minerals will volatilize one component and leave behind the pure metal. Many naturally occurring minerals are sulfide minerals, and they can have the sulfur removed readily by heating, giving off a very obvious sulfurous odor. In contrast, exposing pure metals to the vapor of sulfur can result in the formation of a new metal sulfide. For example, when mercury, a liquid metal at room temperature, is exposed to sulfur vapor, which is white, the new solid that is formed is either yellow or red. And in the understanding of Zosimos, the sulfur had fixed the previously flowing mercury into a single state. Thus, the body was liquid mercury, while the sulfur vapors provided the spirit, or the form, of the final mineral. Zosimos had other evidence, too, that metals could be transformed into something else simply by heating. Mercury can be volatilized by heating, driven off as a gas, and sometimes after the mercury was gone, gold would be left behind. Now, we know today, and you can see a video of this right now on your screen, that mercury can form amalgams with many other metals, a sort of liquid alloy of the two that looks very much like mercury. Now, in the hands of Zosimos, this provided supporting evidence for the idea of metallic transfiguration. So Zosimos had developed a theory that hypothesized that materials, including metals, could be separated into primary parts, and that those primary parts could be recombined into new materials, including gold. Now, the Alexandria of Zosimos' time, roughly the end of the 3rd century and beginning of the 4th century AD, was relatively peaceful. By the late 4th century, though, after the Emperor Constantine's proclamation of Christianity as the official religion of Rome, things changed. Persecution of pagans and heretics became the official policy of the state, and the Pope of Alexandria, Theophilus, you can see him here, executed that policy with brutal efficiency. Pagan temples were razed and destroyed, including the Serapeum, which you can see the ruins of on your screen, the largest and greatest temple to the Greek gods in Alexandria. Non-Christians were driven from their homes and sanctuaries, stripped of their property and subject to brutal violence. Hypatia, a Hellenistic philosopher, mathematician, and astronomer, was murdered by a Christian mob in brutal fashion and her body desecrated after her death. For the alchemists of the time, steeped in Greek philosophical tradition, Alexandria no longer provided a safe haven for the development of their arts. They joined a great refugee diaspora of Jews, heretics, and pagans out of North Africa and east to Syria, later into Persia. These learned philosophers would establish schools across the Near East and share their knowledge of mathematics, philosophy, astronomy, and the art of the Alexandrian alchemists. Now, our story now moves forward to the mid-7th century and the emergence of Islam. Muslim armies swept out of Arabia and across North Africa and the Middle East. In less than 150 years, these conquests created one of the largest pre-modern empires known to history. Under the protection of the caliphs, alchemy would develop extensively during its Arabic period, roughly 750 to 1400. The initial impetus for this development was the incorporation of many Byzantine scholars who had experience as administrators and planners, which many of the early Islamic rulers lacked. Through these scholars, classic works of natural philosophy were translated from their original Greek and Latin into Arabic, making them accessible to a whole new generation of Muslim scholars. Now, Arabic contributions to alchemy start first with the development of the word alchemy. In Arabic, al is the definite article the, and the later part of the word is thought to come from either chemia, a Greek word meaning for Egypt meaning the land of the black worth, or chemia, a term designating the art of metalwork, literally translated as the art of melting metals. Thus, alchemia was used to denote both the art arising from Alexandria in Egypt and the art of metalworking. Medieval Latin would later combine the al and chemia into a single word that would then later be transformed into the alchemy of 14th century English. Beyond the name, Islamic scholars, though, contributed many new theories, apparatuses, and materials to the study of alchemy. One of the first and most significant was Jabir ibn Hayyan, who medieval Europeans would later come to know under the Latinized name Geber. Now, Jabir is purported to have lived somewhere in the late 700s to early 800s and is credited with an enormous number of books, well over 3,000, on topics ranging from the magical to the mundane. The problem with Jabir, however, is one that is common in the history of alchemy, namely that there was almost certainly a group of scholars writing under the name of Jabir to lend credibility and interest to their work. In fact, Jabir as a real, live historical person may not have even existed. Instead, we refer to the writings of Jabir as the Jabirian corpus and credit a group of authors that may have included both male and female scholars writing over a full century. Now, while the Jabirian corpus contains a great number of works on alchemy, the most important and enduring contribution is the MercurySulfur Theory of metals. Now, the origins of this theory go back to Aristotle and Zosimos and had been discussed by other Arabic authors, but it found its fullest descriptions in the hands of the Jabirians. In a nutshell, the MercurySulfur theory proposed that all metals were composed of a liquid-like metal component, the mercury, and a volatile combustible component, the sulfur. It should be noted that they didn't necessarily mean actual elemental mercury and sulfur, but rather two principles that could be combined in varying ratios to generate any metal. Gold, for example, resulted from combining exact proportions of highly pure mercury and sulfur. The use of less pure materials or incorrect ratios produced baser metals. Again, while this theory may seem silly to us today, to the scholars of the 8th century, the MercurySulfur theory neatly explained the observable world. For all of antiquity, only 7 metals had been known: gold, silver, copper, iron, lead, and tin, along with mercury. All of these metals are either found as sulfide minerals or associated with sulfide minerals, meaning that when scratched or heated, they gave off the strong smell of rotten eggs associated with sulfur. And that to have a pure metal sample of one of these, they had to be heated and purified to remove that sulfur. You can look deeper and see more support for this theory, if you will, when we look at how the different metals behave. Mercury is a liquid at room temperature, while tin and lead melt at fairly low temperatures and look indistinguishable from mercury. These metals were thought to have too much of the liquid or mercury component. On the other end, iron and copper are hard to liquefy, but if divided finely into a powder, will burn with a vividly colored flame and give off a sulfurous odor. these metals were thought to have too little of the liquid component. Rust or corrosion was seen as additional evidence of poorly combined ingredients as compared to the more stable gold or silver. To Jabber, this theoretical framework provided a logical pathway to transmutation of base metals into gold. Defects would need to be removed from non-precious metals through purification, and then the purified sulfur and mercury components could be recombined into gold, should the correct proportions be obtained. The Jaberians took this a step farther and assigned a nature to the sulfur-mercury description of metals. Easily melting metals like tin and lead were moist, while the harder melting metals, copper and iron, were dry. To these scholars, this seemed like how the ancient Greek physician Galen described the body, a collection of humors that had to be kept in balance with medicine, or sickness would occur. For the Jaberians, then, there must exist a medicine or an elixir that would cure the imbalances of base metals. And they assumed that these elixirs would have to be highly purified and refined metals that would then be capable of making gold. Now, while the Jaberians provided a logical explanation for transmutation and a pathway for achieving it, in general, the Islamic alchemists did not focus most of their efforts on metallic transmutation. AlRazi, known in the West as Razis, was another notable alchemist that would deeply influence later European alchemy. And he considered transmutation a worthwhile and difficult goal, but not the central goal of alchemy. His book, the Book of Secrets, reads like a laboratory manual for aspiring chemists. And we should understand the title not necessarily as a collection of hidden knowledge, but more, as we might say, the secret to making a good pork chop. Within the book, there are detailed chemical classifications of different substances, instructions on how to recognize and purify each one, and detailed explanations of techniques and apparatuses. Recipes are given for making common products as well. When compared to early Greek alchemy, the Book of Secrets indicates a substantial growth in the scope and practical understanding of alchemy. In fact, the Persian physician, known in the West as Avicenna, argued strongly that transmutation was not possible. His arguments were so persuasive that they would be used by critics of transmutation for centuries. So why do I point out that most Arab alchemists devoted little effort to transmutation or were actively hostile to the idea? Because it demonstrates that at this point in history, alchemy as a field was rapidly growing in breadth and aim beyond just transforming metals, and it would continue to do so over the coming centuries. Now, while alchemy was being preserved and transformed in the Arabic world, the embers of the Roman Empire were slowly dying out in Western Europe. Dissolution of Roman control leads to periods of population migration and the gradual breakdown of Roman culture, social and economic linkages across Europe. In the early Middle Ages, often known as the Dark Ages, literacy decreases and feudalism increases. The knowledge that remains is primarily centered in monasteries in the Catholic Church. However, by the year 1000 CE, things are beginning to change. A warm climate and periods of relative peace, along with innovations in agriculture, lead to a population increase and an exodus to cities. Large centralized kingdoms emerge across Europe, allowing for greater support for education beginning in the 12th century. The first universities are founded between the years 1088 and 1167. At the same time, crusaders returning from the Holy Land bring with them ancient Greek and some forbidden Arabic texts to Europe. This leads to new studies about natural science, philosophy, and math. Likewise, the Reconquista of Spain introduces Arabic knowledge on health and science and philosophy back to Europe as well. And together, this influx of knowledge into Europe provides the theoretical and technical expertise necessary for alchemy to develop in Europe. It's also equally important to realize that by the High Middle Ages, quality glassblowing becomes available, enabling the production of scientific apparatuses. So you find a Europe where all of the pieces are in place for alchemy to flourish and grow. Now, unique somewhat in the course of history, the beginning of European alchemy is often assigned a specific starting date, Friday, February the 11th, 1144 CE. On this date, Robert of Chester completed the translation of On the Composition of Alchemy, the first alchemical text of Middle Ages Europe. Robert was amongst the foremost translators of Arabic in the 12th century and produced the first translation of the Quran into Latin. Like nearly all European scholars of the time, he was a monk, and though of English origin, would spend his adult life in parts of Spain recently freed from Islamic control. By all accounts, Robert's passions were mathematics and astronomy, and like a true scholar, he was driven to complete his translation of On the Composition of Alchemy because, in his own words, our Latin world does not yet know what alchemy is and what its composition is. Robert's introduction of alchemy to Europe comes at a pivotal moment in European history. The Renaissance of the 12th century, which differs from the Renaissance of the 15th and 16th centuries that lives in our popular imagination, witnessed a grand embrace of knowledge and learning. Other translations of alchemical tomes from the Jabirian corpus, AlRazi's and Avicenna, amongst others, would quickly follow Robert's work and found an eager audience amongst the scholarly religious elite of Europe. It's worth noting that while the work of Greek and Arabic alchemists was read and written about with great interest, there were comparatively few practicing alchemists in Europe at this time. Much of the alchemical writing of the 12th century indicates little practical experience with alchemy or metallurgy, and as a consequence, the writings of this time do have a tendency to sort of mix and match bits of older recipes or describe techniques incorrectly. There are exceptions. A monk called Theophilus composed an extremely clear alchemical manual titled On Diverse Arts that you can still buy to this day, that describes in perfect detail substances and methods useful to the monastic craftsman. It's remarkably free of jargon, and again, many recipes can still be used today without trouble. Now, if the scholarly monastic interest in alchemy of the 12th century does not include the actual practice of alchemy, then why is it important in the history of alchemy? Well, for one, the translations of Arabic writings on alchemy that were produced by monasteries disseminated valuable knowledge, both theoretical and practical, across Europe. Two, and perhaps most importantly, the scholarly writings on alchemy produced by these 12th century monks lent an air of respectability and importance to alchemy. The monk Albert the Great and his student St. Thomas Aquinas wrote extensively on alchemy and argued for a separation of theology and secular science, a radical belief of the day. Roger Bacon, a Franciscan friar, wrote several alchemical texts, including 3 major compendiums at the behest of Pope Clement IV. Bacon, who would write on a variety of scholarly subjects, including optics, linguistics, alchemy, and astronomy, also further developed the empirical method of testing first developed by Arab scholars, and is thus credited as one of Europe's first advocates of the scientific method. He is also responsible, at least partly responsible, for the dramatic expansion of alchemy that would occur in the 14th century. Because you see, like many of his contemporaries, Bacon sincerely believed that the second coming of Christ and the final judgment was imminent. Humanity would need to do battle with the Antichrist, and the church and its people would need all the help it could get. He argued that alchemy might be humankind's salvation in the form of new materials, new medicines, and new metals. And as we enter the 14th century and begin our turn towards Newton and the scientific revolution, I think it's important to pause for a moment and evaluate alchemy after its first millennia. From its emergence in the workshops of Alexandria, alchemy had grown as a discipline, grounded in theory and practiced by an international community. Alchemists had developed a variety of pigments, alloys, perfumes, medicines, cosmetics, and a wide variety of techniques. They were the first to distill ethanol, grain alcohol, from wine and beer, first as medicines and then later as a beverage. In many ways, the process modern distillers use today is little changed from that of the 13th century alchemist. Most importantly, it is clear that alchemical information was being freely disseminated in books and manuscripts, challenging the idea of the lone, secretive alchemist. There were, of course, issues. Many wrote under an assumed name or attributed their work to another, more notable figure as a way to increase interest in sales of their work. While some alchemical writings were clear and direct, many relied on the use of decknomen or code names to obscure the identity of a given ingredient or component. And in part, this is where this notion of alchemy as a secretive field art comes from. However, for those who practiced alchemy, these decknomen were either well known within the community or designed to be easily interpreted by a working alchemist. And truthfully, this is not so different from a non-chemist of today trying to interpret a chemical name. To the chemist, 1,3,7-trimethylpurine 2,6-dione unpacks into a specific chemical structure with specific properties. To everyone else, it's just the caffeine in their morning coffee. So by the dawn of the 14th century, alchemy was becoming a widely studied subject amongst the scholar class, respectable and placed alongside mathematics, optics, and astronomy. And it's at this moment in its history that alchemy will begin an evolution that will eventually influence all aspects of science and specifically result in the development of both chemistry and pharmacology as fields of study. So we return now to the 14th century. And this century in Europe marked a period of intense upheaval and social change. Beginning in the year 1300, climate change leads to declining agricultural productivity and famine as Europe enters the Little Ice Age. In 1347, the bubonic plague descends upon the continent, killing as much as 50% of Europe's population. The inability of the church to stop the suffering and death greatly weakens its power, and a further weakening occurs with the Protestant Reformation. The depopulation that results from famine and plague leads to radical social change. Scarce labor weakens feudalism, and better wages for peasants results. And by the end of this century of turmoil, the Renaissance will emerge partly as a reaction to try to understand what has happened. Now, as you might expect, over the course of the 14th century, alchemy begins to take on a religious overtone that it will never fully divest. Partly this occurs because nearly every scholar in Europe at this time has taken holy orders, and the shadow of the church looms large over everything, particularly learning. But this shift is driven more by the events of the century. As Roger Bacon and others had predicted at the end of the last century, the end of the world and the Antichrist had arrived, or at least it seemed to. Famine, plague, and war were all signs that the Apostle Paul had pointed to in his letter to the Thessalonians as indicating that the end of the world was near. Like Roger Bacon, a new generation of religious alchemists clamored for alchemy as mankind's salvation from the coming eternal conflict. Foremost amongst these was John of Rupasissa, a member of the Spirituals, a radical group within the Franciscan order that believed in extreme poverty and shared a loathing of the church's massive wealth. Like many of the Spirituals, John was an outspoken prophet of the world's end. Unlike many of the Spirituals, however, John somehow avoided execution at the hands of the church, and instead spent most of his life in different church prisons, allowed to write and study. While he generally advocated for alchemy as a potential saving grace for humanity in the coming tribulations, he made powerful and convincing arguments specifically in favor of aqua vitae, the water of life, as the alchemical medicine of the apocalypse. Now, aqua vitae is just another name for high-proof alcohol, and it had been known to the church for some time. In fact, the papal residents at Avignon had a distillery. Some alchemists had wisely found favor with the papal court by making aqua vitae steeped with herbs and flavorings. These were the first liqueurs, some of which are actually still made commercially to this day. Now, at one point, some of this aqua vitae had saved John's life after a particularly brutal stint in prison, and afterwards he became an eloquent and persuasive advocate for its use as a medicine. He went further, though, recalling Aristotle's four elements, and named this pure spirit of wine a fifth essence, a quintessence. He reasoned that there should be other quintessence out there that, when highly purified, could preserve other things like human life. That is, didn't seem terribly unreasonable, because wine, if left unattended, would readily vinegar. Wow, aqua vitae would not. Aqua vitae could also prevent meat from rotting. Now, this idea came at a moment of wider reevaluation of medicine and how it was practiced. Many of the so-called medicines of the time, like fresh donkey dung, had been pathetically ineffective against the plague. New times called for new medicines, and alchemical medicines such as iron salts and tin could help with anemia and worms so long as they were pure and did not carry poisons. The effects were obvious and undeniable. Alchemical medicine would continue to grow and develop over the following century, so that by the 1500s, alchemists could produce a wide range of medicines for a variety of ailments. However, all this early work would be overshadowed by the emergence of Paracelsus, one of history's most legendary alchemists in the 16th century. Paracelsus, born Theophrastus Philippus Aureolus Bombastus von Hohenheim, one of the truly great names in history, was born in Switzerland in the late 1400s and had trained in both mining and medicine by his father. As he grew older, he would choose to pursue medicine, though he rapidly developed a method of treatment that stood in stark contrast to the preferred methods of the day. You see, by the early 1500s, the Renaissance had begun and brought with it a love of all things ancient, including Galen, the famed philosopher and father of medicine. In Galenic medicine, disease was caused by an imbalance of the humors. Thus, any cure must rebalance the humors through some combination of sweating, purging, bleeding, or emetics. Paracelsus took the opposite view and believed that the body was best suited to heal itself. While this method was effective, it did nothing to endear him to his patients, who expected more from their physician. Eventually, Paracelsus would recognize the need to obfuscate his hands-off treatment and developed impressive yet totally ineffectual treatments like treating the wound, the weapon that caused the wound, or treating a plant that looks similar to the diseased organ. These, of course, did nothing to help the patient that its own body wasn't already doing, but at least it convinced them that they were doing something profound and important. However, for all of this subterfuge, Paracelsus was a highly competent alchemist and developed some of the first chemotherapies to treat diseases. He also realized that toxic materials, such as antimony, could have powerful therapeutic effects, but that also only the dose makes the poison. That's his phrase. Often, his use of highly toxic inorganic compounds or minerals would be accompanied by an extensive washing and purification step that inevitably would reduce the concentration to safer limits. His methods and his obvious success would inspire new generations of alchemical physicians who would identify as Paracelsian. Now, some of these Paracelsians remembered their hero's admonition that the dose makes the poison, but others did not and pursued even higher doses to achieve their desired outcomes. Over time, the efficaciousness of alchemical medicine would be so undeniable that medicine would swing towards alchemical medicines. And it didn't hurt that, unlike Galenic cures, which came from the pagan Galen, alchemy had a good Christian background. Now, eventually, later alchemists like Peter Severinius and Heinrich Kunrath would start productive dialogues about how alchemical medicine should be applied. They'd blend the use of mineral medicines and traditional herbal remedies together. It was this development of chemotherapy, along with improvements in surgery and a deeper understanding of physiology, that would pave the way into modern science. And so today, Paracelsus is credited as the father of toxicology, and the close link between chemistry and medicine continues to this day. Now, while alchemy was helping to transform medicine, it was continuing to grow and develop in other areas. A new alchemical industry was developing, focused on methods to produce and manufacture salts, pigments, dyes, mineral acids, distillates, perfumes, and a host of other goods. Alchemy was inevitably bound up with the painters of the Renaissance. As there were no commercially available paints, the masters of the Renaissance had to manufacture their own, which required a functional knowledge of alchemy. In some cases, the symbolism of alchemy made its way into the painting. Jan van Eyck's Arnulfi marriage shows two figures, a man and a woman, standing together, evoking the symbolism of older alchemical emblematic images that represented the fusion of sulfur, male, and mercury, female. Alchemy was becoming a mature discipline, a common and important component of scholarship for the learned man, or woman in some cases. The number of practitioners was growing dramatically, bringing alchemical ideas and practices into the mainstream, including testing and developing new theories via experimental inquiry. During the years 1500 to 1700, when the scientific revolution was rewriting human knowledge, alchemy was at its height, and many of the most notable scientific names at the time practiced alchemy. Few men had as lasting an impact on both alchemy and the wider scientific world as John Dee. Born in 1527 to a courtier of Henry VIII, the young John would earn a reputation for intelligence, and at the age of 15 attend Cambridge University. Unfortunately, because of a particularly clever stage effect during a play, he would also earn a reputation as a magician that would dog him for the rest of his life. The young John would travel the continent in the 1540s, studying mathematics and astronomy before returning to England with a reputation as a great scholar. For an example, he developed rational arguments that every element in the universe emitted rays of force, thus laying the groundwork for the recognition of gravity. He was a trusted advisor to Queen Elizabeth on issues of science and astrology, and even was responsible for determining the date of her coronation. It was actually John Dee who first laid out the arguments for British expansionism and was the first to coin the term British Empire. Now, importantly for us, Dee was also a prolific alchemist who had intended to found a major research institute at his home in Mortlake. He was also increasingly interested in magic and crystal gazing as he grew older, and perhaps more than anyone else from this time period is responsible for alchemy's eventual association with the occult. You see, in 1564, he published Monas Hieroglyphica, which explained an esoteric hieroglyphic symbol of Dee's own design that fused mathematics, alchemy, and Kabbalist magic. As he grew ever older and studied more of mathematics and the new learning, Dee believed that there was a certain magic hidden within this new knowledge, and that he could not proceed farther without some divine intervention. To that end, in 1581, he began to search for a medium who could help him communicate with angels. And in one of history's great mysteries, this incredibly learned, wise man settled on a known con man, Edward Kelly, who had had his ears removed for fraud. Kelly's crystal gazing and communication with the angels immediately began to give Dee surprisingly accurate predictions, though many speculate that Kelly himself engineered these predictions. Regardless, for the next 7 years, Kelly and Dee worked closely together. Kelly would relay messages from the angels by crystal gazing and seances, and Dee believed he received an angelic mission to create a new world based partly on science, alchemy, and rationalism. The full story of this collaboration is much too long and much too colorful to tell tonight, though it involves a hurried departure from England to avoid arrest, a stay in the court of the Holy Roman Emperor, nearly triggering a civil war within the Holy Roman Empire, and eventually a message from the angels that the two men must swap wives. Eventually, though, Dee would return to England at the summons of Queen Elizabeth, with his reputation in tatters and his labs and libraries in England ransacked. Despite Dee's tragic fall from scholar of renown to disgraced mystic, his influence on the alchemists that followed him was pronounced. On the one hand, in England at least, Dee leaves a lasting whiff of the occult on alchemy, and we'll see a slow but steady turn away from being associated with this term. On the other hand, Dee's vision of a scientific utopia appears to have greatly resonated with many of those who followed. One such man was Francis Bacon, another brilliant young thinker who, in his younger years, had been mentored by Dee before he began to talk with the angels. Despite his connection with Dee and the older man standing as England's greatest thinker of the time, Bacon's public work scrupulously avoids any mention of Dee. Eventually, Bacon would become an outspoken critic of alchemy, claiming it impeded the discovery of new knowledge and criticizing many of its practitioners. He particularly criticized John Dee's ideas about communicating with God in the service of science. So it was particularly shocking then when, after his death, he posthumously published the novel The New Atlantis, which laid out a Christian scientific utopia shockingly close to John Dee's. In fact, there's a credible theory that Dee and Bacon had been collaborators all their lives, and that Bacon's attacks on Dee and alchemy were in part a smokescreen to avoid falling under the similar taint of occult magic that had dogged John Dee for all his life. Regardless, this utopian vision born out of mystic alchemy and laid out by Bacon and Dee would deeply influence the men who had found the Royal Society and helped shape the early institution. Now, many of the men who had initially formed the Royal Society were heavily involved in alchemy and advocated for a distinctly Christian alchemical worldview in line with John Dee. Most notable amongst these was Samuel Hartlib, a German polymath who had emigrated to England in the late 1620s. Hartlib was obsessively devoted to furthering knowledge and maintained a wide array of contacts across England and Europe. He made contributions in a wide range of areas and was deeply influenced by both John Dee and alchemy. As part of his correspondences, Hartlib, who fancied himself Europe's intelligencer, gathered around himself a group of scientifically minded friends who were working towards the establishment of the scientific society that would eventually become the Royal Society. Alchemy played a large role within this Heartland Circle. George Starkey, an American alchemist of some skill, was a member of the circle. Starkey also wrote a series of wildly successful alchemical books under the pseudonym Irenaeus Philalethes. At least 8 other members of the circle actively practiced alchemy, and Hartlib himself at one point supported an operation to make alchemical gold on an industrial scale. For Hartlib and his friends, the goal was the establishment of a universal college, deeply inspired by the New Atlantis, and this would eventually become the Royal Society. But while Hartlib and his circle worked towards the establishment of what would become the Royal Society, alchemy as a field was slowly undergoing a schism. And this schism is probably best represented in the person of Robert Boyle, who is often considered the first modern chemist. The year after Francis Bacon's death, Robert Boyle would be born as the 14th child of Richard Boyle, 1st Earl of Cork, who had a large role in the pacification of Ireland. As the son of a peer, young Robert traveled the continent, learning the new knowledge coming from Italy and elsewhere. In 1541, Boyle and his tutor spent the winter in Florence, studying the banned works of Galileo, perhaps even with the man himself, who died during the winter they were there. When he returned to England, he was introduced to the Heartland Circle by his sister, and through them, the study of alchemy. There were two great influences on Boyle's life. One was George Starkey, the American alchemist, who collaborated with him on a variety of alchemical transformations, including the preparation of philosophical mercury, an ultra-pure form of mercury that's made using antimony. The other was Jan Baptista van Helmont, a Belgian scholar and alchemist whose theories deeply resonated with Boyle. These theories were grounded in traditional alchemy, particularly the work of Paracelsus, and advocated strongly for the role of experimentation in the development of a new theory. Van Helmont was the first to use the word gas and would also identify carbon dioxide. It was through the work of these men that Boyle developed into a true alchemist in every sense of the word, pursuing transmutation and helping to get a law against alchemical multiplication of gold and silver repealed. He actively believed in the religious aspect and the mythical aspect of alchemy as well. However, as the son of a peer, Boyle believed that alchemist had vulgar connotations, and so he specifically referred to himself as a chemist. Before, alchemy and chemistry had been used interchangeably. Now, thanks to Boyle and others, the meanings began to diverge. Chemistry could lay claim on the mundane experimental aspects of alchemy, the studies into the composition of metals and materials in the manufacture of chemical goods. Alchemy was left to hold the mystical, occult aspects of itself, and eventually the idea of transmutation. This break was further accelerated by the changing scientific community in England at the time. Though many of the men who would meet and correspond were active alchemists, there was a steady secularization of the group, in large part a consequence of the English Civil War. In 1659, John Dee's spiritual diary was published with a brutal and mocking foreword by Merrick Casaubon, which portrayed Dee as naive and dealing with the devil. The impact of this on alchemy was immediate, adding an air of embarrassment, and any public hint of mystic alchemy was suppressed going forward. The break between alchemy and chemistry, then, is less driven by a meaningful break between the two disciplines, but instead is driven by the need to separate away the embarrassing, vulgar parts of alchemy from the more useful and mundane parts. In short, it's a classic case of rebranding to avoid bad PR. And so this brings us back to Isaac Newton, one of the last true alchemists. For all of Newton's various scientific pursuits, it is clear that alchemy was by far the most extensive and consistent across his lifetime. Estimates suggest he wrote over 1 million words on alchemy over the course of his professional career. Much of his effort was devoted to finding the Philosopher's Stone, the mythic component that would enable metallic transmutation. Modern evidence demonstrates that Newton suffered from mercury poisoning as a result of these investigations. And working at a time where alchemy was steadily falling out of favor, Newton was far more secretive of his work than alchemists of previous generations. In correspondence with Boyle about alchemy, Newton regularly admonishes him to be more circumspect and discreet about what he discloses publicly. By the founding of the Royal Society, many of Newton's contemporaries had fully embraced René Descartes' view of the world that completely separated the physical world from the immaterial realm. It proposed a mechanical view of nature, where things could be mathematically and explicitly predicted and understood. It seems clear that Newton did not subscribe to this view and believed that Descartes went too far, that there was some vital force or soul that directed matter in a non-mechanical or predictable way. The evidence suggests that Newton was deeply influenced by John Dee's mystical alchemy and utopian visions of science. All of this taken together suggests that the 61-year-old Newton, having newly taken on the presidency of the Royal Society, stood singularly astride a transitional moment in history. He looked out on a world with very different eyes from those of his contemporaries. In a very real way, he was the last alchemist. And it would seem that over his last 20 plus years as Royal Society president, Newton would ensure the survival of alchemy, at least in part, by transforming the institution, bringing with him the best of alchemical practice. The laboratory-centered, mathematical, communal, and cumulative aspects of alchemy became the professional standard of practice within all areas of first the Royal Society and eventually all of the European scientific societies. By the end of his tenure, the Royal Society had begun to look like the research institute first envisioned by John Dee, a necessary prelude to the utopia outlined in the New Atlantis. Newton's in his writings refused to fully separate the material from the immaterial realm. Harkening back to the mystical religious alchemy of a time before, he believed the world around him was not strictly mechanical, that all things could not be exactly known. And while the separation of science from religion has remained consistent, Newton allowed for the introduction of inspiration and serendipity into modern science. And centuries later, at the dawn of quantum physics, Newton's view of the world would prove to be largely more durable than the exact mechanical view of the world of his contemporaries. At the smallest scales of matter, mathematically exact predictions can no longer be made. Instead, probability dominates and phenomena arise that seemingly violate the laws of the observable physical universe. Because contrary to popular belief, science is not immutable or fixed, but is an ever-changing set of theories and hypotheses that are constantly scrutinized, refined, and replaced. Within this context, alchemy's place is abundantly clear. It was the first experimental science, born when the practical techniques of Alexandrian artisans were fused with the theories of Greek philosophers. Over time, those theories were tested, and as experiments revealed new aspects of the world, replaced by better theories. While the sulfur-mercury theory of today seems silly at best, for its time, it was a cutting-edge understanding of the world. Alchemy allowed for the development of the first chemical industries, giving the world a host of products, from pigments and dyes to medicines to liqueurs. At its best, alchemy demonstrated that humans could not only reproduce nature, but in some cases even improve upon nature through careful purification and transformation. Alchemical work required an understanding of the natural world that led alchemists to carefully catalog substances and materials, to note the conservation of weight in their experiments, and to fully and actually attempt to understand the natural world. Even alchemy's most derided aspects, the transmutation of metals, can be viewed in a different light with the preparation of super heavy elements that began in the middle of the last century. Admittedly, the transmutating agent is a particle accelerator, far beyond the possibilities of any alchemist, and the amount of materials produced infinitesimally small. But even Glenn Seaborg, the Nobel Prize-winning chemist responsible for the creation of the first super heavy atoms, recognized the potential connection to historical alchemy. At the time of alchemy's greatest influence, roughly 1500 to 1700s in Europe, its study was pursued by most scholars who were influenced by its recursive experimental approach to knowledge. Even the mystical religious aspects of alchemy, introduced in the High Middle Ages and culminating in the person of John Dee, inspired the creation and structure of the Royal Society and left the door open to serendipity and inspiration playing a key role in the scientific process. Advances in science, technology, and medicine today have allowed us to be the safest, most comfortable group of humans in history, hinting in many ways at the utopian vision of John Dee and the mystic alchemists. Yet, it was that marriage of alchemy with religion and the occult that would eventually lead to its downfall. The whiff of magic surrounding alchemy and the shift of learned men to a more secular view of the world meant that the word alchemy now carried a vulgar, embarrassing connotation. Scholarly men of the late 17th century, studying the new learning of Copernicus, Galileo, Bacon, and Newton, had no wish to be associated with alchemy, and thus the split between alchemy and chemistry was born. Into chemistry would go the experimental learning of alchemy and the knowledge of chemical manufacturing, eventually arriving at the modern field of chemistry. While the occult, mystical aspects, along with transmutation, would be left to alchemy. Now, chemistry would indicate something modern and scientific, while alchemy would indicate something outdated and non-scientific. A reinvention of alchemy beginning in the 1850s is a process of spiritual self-purification, and its incorporation into a variety of esoterica and mythical societies by the end of the 19th century would only amplify that perception in modern times. But the truth is that the break between so-called modern science and alchemy is an artificial one, a rebranding of convenience. Much like the husk of a seed that protects the seed until it's ready to sprout and grow into a new plant, so too was alchemy to modern science. And while the husk may fall away, discarded as no longer needed, it is no less an essential part of the life of the plant. Thank you.
Well, thank you. It's great, great presentation, John. And I just sort of noticed a couple things personally that you were talking about the like the symbol of Mercury, the chemical is what we use now for symbol for the planet Mercury. Although unclear how much actual Mercury is actually on Mercury, but and also just sort of noted that it seems like science and the search for for that has always sort of run into loggerheads with religion and politics, and so I guess sort of like what we're sort of at times what we seem to be experiencing now, like even around the pandemic and whatever, that's been going on for centuries. So, well, so we do have a few questions here, and a number of people said, well, first of all, thank you, a great presentation, fantastic. Mike asks, does Eastern medicine, aka like Chinese medicine, have any kind of basis derived in alchemy? It seems like a lot of what you were focused on seemed to be mostly in European and Middle Eastern origin. Is there any connection into the Far East?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Eastern alchemy is definitely it's a branch of alchemical learning. In fact, really all traditional medicines are often sort of lumped as part of the family of alchemy. I focused specifically on sort of Western European alchemy because its connections to what we term the scientific revolution, right? This sort of very Eurocentric development of physics and astronomy and mathematics and chemistry. But alchemy is a term and as a concept is far broader. And you can spend an enormous amount of time just sort of exploring that traditional medicine aspect of alchemy. Definitely.
Interesting. Actually, David asks, although we know that you're a chemist, you clearly have a very strong knowledge of history. Is that sort of a personal interest of yours, or just happen to be part of what you did in researching this particular topic?
Yeah, it's funny. I had applied to college and intended to go major in history, and somehow, by the time I arrived on campus, I had switched to chemistry and engineering. So I've always found it fascinating, and I think, there's a perception that science is always sort of forward-looking, but often, we draw a lot of inspiration looking backwards, right? It's sort of an open secret, sometimes a joke, that the best ideas in chemistry and physics are often found in the literature 40, 50, 60 years ago, right? Some idea that sort of reached the limits of its time, but now we can go back and with with a deeper understanding and new tools can pursue. And so, to me, I think it's very valuable and essential to really have an understanding of where my field comes from and how it develops, because it influences how we carry it out as a science today.
Exactly. And also, David asked, are there any books of note that you would point our viewers toward if they wanted to learn more about that?
Let me grab one here. So this is a particularly good one. Anything by Lawrence Principi. Can you see that on the screen reasonably well?
Actually, you know what? If you unshare, I think that'll make it a little larger. Yeah, there we go.
Right. So this book here, The Secrets of Alchemy,
all right,
is by Lawrence Principi, is an absolute gem. He's done a lot of work in sort of revisiting Newton and Boyle's role in alchemy, and so that's a really great one. Let me see. I have another good one here. For those who are interested in trying their hand at a little bit of alchemy, this one is particularly great too. The Chemistry of Alchemy by Cobb, Federolf, and Goldwhite. This book is particularly notable and something I really enjoy because between the chapters it includes alchemical experiments you can do at home with a little bit of willingness. So it's a fun read.
All right, or at some point maybe somebody will write Alchemy for Dummies kind of thing. Right? Exactly. Let's see here. I think one person had asked, I had mentioned that I'd heard you on a podcast. You don't actually have your own podcast, correct?
No, I do not.
All right. Yep. This was on the podcast, a shortwave. This is an NPR, and you can get it from wherever you get your podcasts. Again, this has been a great presentation. It's nice to know sort of where things come from, and again, also even referencing to Kopernik, and again, he had difficulty convincing the people of the day of his observations and calculations. So, what we do? Maria has a question. This is Egypt's in Africa. So why is Dr. Swierk referring to it as Europe or the West? Or did I hear it incorrectly?
So No, certainly not, right? So Alexandria is in northern Africa, and the alchemy that we sort of think of as Western alchemy and that influences the scientific revolution in European alchemy does arise out of Africa, right? So it starts in Alexandria, it then sort of moves to the Arabic-speaking world, and then it comes back to Europe. And those early stages are really important in its sort of formation, its kind of philosophical underpinnings. Mm-hmm. But really, alchemy finds its sort of fullest expression when it reaches Europe and sort of mostly the 15th to 18th century. Right. There's a period of an intense sort of experimentation, of development. Alexandrian alchemy is mostly focused on metallic transmutation. Right. Arabic alchemy begins to broaden the scope. But really, from a technical and theoretical perspective, the huge expansion happens within Europe.
Right. Very good. Very good. Well, again, I thank you very much. I think you answered many of the people's questions during your presentation, and so again, for those that are watching, we want to thank also Broome Pediatrics, who is a sponsor of our live stream. But again, if this is something that you value and enjoy, and are in a position, if you look down in the description below in YouTube, you have an opportunity to offer a donation to help us offset the cost of running what it is that we do up here at Kopernik. I'll just remind people again that you can also view our previous. You can be well in a few minutes. You'll be able to actually watch this over again if you wish. But also you can look at some of our previous live streams, including some live observing sessions with Jeremy Cardy, our live stream astronomer. He actually did an interesting thing. He recently purchased a Lego version of the space station and the Hubble telescope, which just had its 31st anniversary of being pressed into service, and you can actually watch him put it together in sort of a time lapse, which is sort of fun to watch him do that. Again, we've got another couple of next week is another BU professors, two BU professors talking about the cicadas that'll be emerging this very soon in the next weeks, and we'll continue to do our live streams as often as we can dig up or find secure speakers for it. And then finally, I also want to remind you about two things that with our Rocket Fest, it'll be on May 22nd, but people are building them at home. We actually have 2 slots left for our 9 a.m. launch window. So if you want to try working building one of those Estes rockets, go on and sign up, and we can find a way to get the rockets to you. And also making you aware that, again, if you've got children or grandchildren that might be interested in a summer camp, we have summer camps that are open. One is already closed off. We've got 2 more that just have one more slot available, and so check that out as well. So thank you, Professor Swierk. I really appreciate your time. We'd love to have you up here talk on another topic here in person.
Great, thank you. I'd love to come back.
All right, so have a good evening. Stay safe. Please wear that mask. Please get vaxxed, and we'll look forward to having everybody up here soon. So long.